As writers and as people, Anne Sexton and Sylvia Plath hold many similarities. Both artists take on a modernist style, employing the stream of consciousness approach to convey meaning. Both women wrote on their experiences as women in society, criticizing sexist cultures within their environments. Modernism denotes a style of writing in which the speaker uses an anonymous and objective voice to comment on society and its interaction within the human condition, focusing on how individuals are affected by culture in a specific region or place in time. Sylvia Plath, a modernist and a confessionalist, clearly poured her ideas into her writing. Her poems concern her life as an individual, but still ultimately hark to societal ideas that affect society, from taking the perspective of an individual. Anne Sexton, a modernist confessionalist as well, a colleague of Plath's and renowned writer for her brilliant, sardonic, and vulnerable verse, similarly utilizes her personal experience to draw conclusions about the nature of the world. There's not much point building stark walls between the realms of confessionalism and modernism. Plath and Sexton's poetry is centered around themselves, but the poetry speaks on experiences relevant to all women in their time, as well as humanity as a whole. Both women's poetry criticizes social status, relationships with family, the tense societal relationship between men and women, sexual conservatism, and ultimately comes back to pain that every individual feels because of who we are and where we are. It is a commentary on the effect of society on any anonymous individual psyche as much as it is a confession of their own. In general, modernists rebel against straightforward writing and formulated verse, preferring fragmented storytelling, inspired by the shattered state of society during and following the First World War. For example, take this extract from Plath's poem, Cut. See specifically the enjambment employed between lines 4 and 5 across two different stanzas. Plath continues the use of enjambment throughout the text to evoke the idea of shifting metaphors that morph into one another. Similarly to an individual observing a cut thumb, the poem takes on the consciousness of separated tableaus of thought, unrestrained by strict stanzas. The plainsong paratactic style, simple yet cryptic in meaning, combined with her use of syntax to produce the disjointed tone of the poem, exemplifies the modernist approach Plath took to literature. Sexton studied with Plath, and the friendship between the two is well documented in cultural mythos. Sexton similarly employs and develops a modernist style through her writing. The example chosen here is the poem Consorting with Angels. Sexton likewise uses enjambment across lines 1 and 2 of the poem's first stanza, utilizing repetition of the pronoun I and derivatives such as I'm across lines 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7 to enhance the disjointed, jerky nature of the poem. Thus, the stream of consciousness tone is adopted through employing standalone observations of the self. Sexton's confessional poetry is known for its frankness, its willingness to reveal intimate details of the poet's life, and its use of personal experience as a means of exploring universal themes. In Consorting with Angels, Sexton continues this tradition, using language that is frank, raw, and often shocking. Her poems are filled with sexual imagery, references to mental illness, and confrontations with death. She famously described her own poem as the vomit of the soul, and this is apparent in the visceral quality of her language. Consorting with Angels is a textbook example of confessionalism, endowed with the personal experience, imagery, and allegory to provide insight into the human condition. Sexton's language is neither plain nor overstyled, providing a balanced use of both plainsong and baroque prose. The stream of consciousness approach allows the reader to understand the emotions of the narrator, creating a sense of empathy with the poet, and providing a connection between reader and author. Such is the power of confessional poetry, a style adopted and adapted by both Sexton and Plath. The poets hold thematic as well as structural similarities, being both women of the same generation with starkly similar middle-class upbringings. It makes sense the content of their writings would see very similar perspectives, focusing on the field of feminism. Two sampled poems here are Plath's The Applicant and Sexton's Her Kind. The Applicant by Sylvia Plath criticizes societal standards and gender roles, a radical feminist literary expression, at least for the time. Plath adopts a sarcastic, cynical tone to describe the woman as an item, especially a household appliance, signifying that women are valued only for their domestic utility. The speaker in the poem, surely a man, questions an applicant, another man, on the suitability of a potential wife. The first line, first, are you our sort of person, instantly establishes the scrutinous tone of the poem, as if the reader were applying for a job. personally influenced through the pronoun you. Plath employs this metaphor to illustrate how women are selected or rejected based on shallow and antiquated criteria. The woman is likened to a living doll who can sew and cook, devoid of agency, a simple tool created to perform household tasks. The diction and repetition utilized through the pronoun it objectifies the woman, emphasizing the feminist concept of a woman objectified in a misogynistic society. The line, "It can talk about things you like to entertain you," highlights women's commercialization as sources of amusement for males in society. Similarly, Her Kind by Anne Sexton uses symbolism in the idea of a witch to implicate a woman ostracized by society and symbolically burned as a consequence of her defiance of societal expectations. Nevertheless, Sexton employs a more Baroque-esque writing style compared to Plath's plainsong, at least in this poem as an individual, which brings forward a more musical and mythical tone to the poem through the selectively intricate diction. Plath's more straightforward descriptive poem contrasts this in its cold and objective tone, which brings a separate analysis of women's oppression as women are seen as objects to be sold. Her Kind instead examines women who defy societal expectations and the fate they receive, through employing diction reminiscent of folklore and fairy tales to construct a proverbial cautionary tale. Thus, Sexton and Plath differ in their own expressions of the thematic idea of women's liberation, with Plath taking on a more defeatist, straightforward angle compared to Sexton's wild, darkly optimistic view of her own defiant role within a patriarchy. Given the kinship between the women, Plath and Sexton clearly influenced each other in a creative manner. An example of Plath's that bears the heaviest influence of her friend Sexton is Daddy, written on October 12, 1962, which bears the mark of heavy Sexton influence from her poem My Friend, which was published in 1959. The assonance and rhyme employment of the oo sound, allusions to Judaism and the Holocaust, the five-line stanzas, and the flexible A-A-B-B rhyme structure of each poem indicates Sexton's influence on Plath. Furthermore, each poem explores loss and the dichotomy of resentment and grief within the speaker. My Friend concerns a deceased friend of Sexton, and the implied but never explained treachery mentioned. This is echoed in Plath's poem, dissecting the psyche of the titular father and his impact on her life. The sharing of creative voices, marked by the paratactic structure and heavy confessionalism of the two, indicates the value of their kinship. Furthermore, poems from Plath's collection Ariel heavily inspired Sexton's later poetry in turn. See the echo of Plath's 1962 Lady Lazarus in Sexton's much later composed Cripples and Other Stories. Sexton's work here is quite obviously a rehash of Plath, but as the theme of the poem in question is a satire of the influence of others on her life, a poem she refers to as a silly rhyme, it would be unfair to suggest Sexton was copying Plath, at least with the intention to deceive. Indeed, although I've been tasked with determining the author I believe has the superior style, I find the similarities yet distinct individuality of both authors difficult to compare in terms of superiority. But I have to get a grade. While Plath's poetry is written in a grandiose classical diction, Sexton's poetic voice is more informal, daring to dissect taboo subjects including drug addiction and sexual violence. Indeed, I find that a particular strength of plainsong prose is the ability to be at once emotionally impactful and accessible in the layman's psyche. The detached Plathian style doesn't strike the same personal chord with me. I believe Anne Sexton is the preferred artist, in my opinion. Her use of lyrical expression combined with shocking macabre imagery is more heavily imposed upon the reader through her use of unapologetic language. Sexton's writing is more straightforward, with her poems holding more resemblance to Plath's 26 explosion-age Ariel poems, composed from October 1962. While Plath's formalized pieces operate with striking control over the oral and visual imagery evoked in her writing, Sexton's work offers a visceral and unforgivingly personal commentary which is far more evocative to the reader. While both poets use disjointed syntax and paratactic prose to create a disjointed tone of stream of consciousness, Plath leans more towards the periodic style compared to Sexton's looser writing. The disjointed manner presents the audience with the thesis of the poem, moving into the emotional value of the text in a manner which is unique to Sexton, whose writing is less cryptic and more poignant in nature. Both poets are talking to themselves and to everyone at the same time, but Sylvia, perhaps as a consequence of her more formalized employment of legitimate literary techniques, creates poetry which is not relative or evocative to most readers without first serious contemplation or heavy study in the field of literature. This is not a weakness in itself, but it limits the connection of the world with her poetry. For example, in her poem Stings, Plath dissects the complicated subject matter of existentialism, what it means to be alive and to have agency, through the metaphor of a queen bee to draw parallels in the reader's mind between the animal and human world. Plath, while connecting with the human condition through illustrating universal experiences such as anxiety over losing originality or strangeness and becoming a drudge compared to a worker bee in the metaphor, is undercut by the hieratic style which omits the personal colloquial edge that Sexton provides in her poem A Poet of Ignorance, which explores similar thematic concepts of existence and the reliability of human perception. The style is colloquial, employing the demotic terms I do not know and the repetition of perhaps to illustrate a wandering period of the human psyche. The reprise I do not know in the final line of the first stanza, defeatist in its call and response nature to the philosophical questions posed, is deeply touching to the reader, who understands intuitively that by failing to arrive at an answer, the writer is humbly forced to stand back and consider the very meaning of an idea for life. It would be offensive and untrue to call Plath pompous in her more complicated style, but she's certainly less accessible. Accessibility isn't an end in itself, but when considering the value of art for its ability to evoke an emotional response, Anne Sexton is clearly a trailblazer in her writing. Her style is in no way emotionally detached in the way Plath can be. Emotionally informed, straightforward, and agonizing, Sexton's work is holistically the more relatable, stimulating, and darkly amusing of the two.